In terms of disorders of the female reproductive system, there are simple basic disorders that occur pretty commonly, infection or inflammation. And so some of these infections are called exogenous infections. They come from the outside world and usually caused by organisms that are in or on the body. So one example would be like a yeast infection. Okay, that can lead to, so these exogenous infections can lead to vaginitis, which is where the vaginal lining itself can get infected. Oftentimes, again, a yeast infection can cause this, or an STD, a sexually transmitted disease. Different organisms and different viruses can lead to an STD. And then there's pelvic inflammatory disease, which is basically any inflammation, acute inflammation, so it comes on real quick, that can affect the uterus, the uterine tubes, the ovaries, or any or all of them at one time. And it's also usually caused by an infection, sometimes microbial, sometimes fungal, again, and sometimes viral. In addition to that, there are tumors, myoma or fibroid tumors. These are tumors that can occur inside of the uterus or even on the ovaries. There can be ovary fibroids. In addition to that, there is the potential for ovarian cysts. These cysts are big chambers filled with fluid. They're enlargements, but they're different from the Graafian follicles. These cysts, the most common are the follicular cysts. These would be a Graafian follicle that began developing. Maybe you had two follicles, or somebody had two follicles developing at one time, and one went through development and maturation normally, but the other one got stuck, I guess you would say, quit developing. And so those follicular cysts are cysts that never completely developed into a Graafian follicle and ruptured open, releasing the ovum. There are luteal cysts. These are the ones that are most symptomatic. This can occur during, after a Graafian follicle bursts, and basically the tissue doesn't become resorbed. Typically, though, either follicular or luteal cysts usually resolve by about 60 days. So these cysts should resorb back into the ovary. Endometriosis is another disease where there is endometrial tissue that exists outside of the uterus. Now, this happens during the development of the fetus. And so sometimes when the uterus is developing, the tissue that should have become the endometrial lining, those cells migrate away from the uterus before it's actually a uterus and establish themselves elsewhere. And they're sensitive to changes in the female reproductive hormone expression. So as estrogen goes up, let's say there's a piece of endometrial tissue on the ligament attaching the ovary to the uterus. That little piece of tissue would respond just like it would inside of the uterus. So as estrogen goes up, it would thicken, and as progesterone comes on and estrogen goes away, bleeding would commence. And that can cause problems and infections sometimes, actually, in a woman who has endometriosis. It's very painful as well. Breast cancer is a very common type of cancer in women. Breast cancer can happen in men as well. It's just much more common in women because the mammary tissue hypertrophies or grows as a young woman gets older, and the tissue is exposed to estrogen. Ovarian cancer also can happen. Ovarian cancer oftentimes is the result of metastases or cancer cells from breast cancer entering circulation and establishing themselves adjacent to an ovary. Or ovarian cancer can happen independently. And oftentimes, many of these types of cancers are linked to genetics. So that's a different conversation. We're just talking just briefly about disorders of the female reproductive tract or system. These cancers can be detected by a pap smear, where a doctor removes cells from the cervix and tests for the presence of cancer cells. And then infertility can also be a reproductive failure. Obviously, it's failure, but a reproductive disorder where infertility comes from a situation where an infection had occurred, like a staph infection, inflammation, tumors, fibroid tumors inside of the uterus, and also hormonal imbalances. So as a summary, the female system produces ova, okay, not eggs, ova. It receives sperm from the male. It permits fertilization to occur, usually in the fallopian tubes, actually. And then fetal development proceeds after fertilization when the zygote implants itself into the fully matured endometrial lining inside of the uterus. And then lactation occurs after the baby is born. Sex hormones themselves are required for the development of these secondary sexual characteristics like breasts and matured sexual organs in the reproductive system. And sex hormones are really important for reproductive functions in both sexes. Male and female women, we have testosterone, and men, you guys have a little bit of estrogen in there. Sexually transmitted diseases are diseases that are transmitted sexually during intercourse, but they can also be transmitted sometimes other ways. They can be transmitted basically through the fluids that are involved during sexual intercourse. They're most common of all the communicable diseases, believe it or not, STDs, and they're caused by a variety of organisms. They could be a parasite, in some cases, virus, or a bacterium.